1 second for it to kick in. Well, welcome everyone for another Massachusetts Peace Action webinar, and a special one tonight at that, as we're going to be joined by the policy team from the Harvard Kennedy School as a research report that they're going to be previewing for us tonight. But before we get into that, if this is your first time on a Massachusetts Peace Action webinar, just a little bit in brief about us. Massachusetts Peace Action is the largest grassroots peace organization in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We're part of the Peace Action Network, which has affiliates all across the United States, and a history that goes back to 1957, when we started as an organization dedicated to the abolition of nuclear weapons, which is still a major goal of Massachusetts Peace Action and the Peace Action Network. Since then, we've also expanded our work. We work on a whole litany of things, including trying to shrink the military budget and moving that money towards human needs here at home. Human needs like housing, education, fighting climate change. We also work to end interventions and stop sanctions. And we also work on issues of racial justice. We work on Middle East policy. We work on Latin America. We work on the whole broad spectrum of peace issues. And we recommend folks to get involved. We are truly a grassroots organization powered by the work of our volunteers and our activists, and we always need more help in our work. But tonight, we're going to do something special. We're actually breaking new ground. I'll tell you a little bit of background about how this happened. In the late spring, the Harvard Kennedy School reached out to us and said that the policy team, which is a think tank, an undergraduate-run think tank, was picking a project and would like to work with us to choose a topic and really do some in-depth research. So we did some planning with them and came up with the topic of sanctions and climate change. So what you're about to hear is a virtual presentation, and I think someone might be unmuted. So if that's you, if you could mute yourself, or Cole, if you could find the person and mute them, that would be helpful. But what you're going to hear is a research program that looks at the effects of US sanctions, how they're applied, to which countries they're applied, and the effect on the ability globally to fight climate change. So it should be a fantastic program. I'll remind you that we will be having question and answer at the end. So if you think of a good question, just write it down and we'll have you raise your hand at the end of the presentation, and we'll bring you up on screen so you can ask the research team your question. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to one of the team leaders, Alexandra Okonomu, who will preview the program.
Hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be here with you all tonight. I am Alexandra Konomu. I'm one of the 3 team leads for the Global Peace team of the policy program. Let me just share my screen so that we can actually start the presentation. Here you go. So as Brian mentioned, tonight we're going to be discussing sanctions and climate change. We are going to do an overview of how the US has been implementing sanctions over the previous decades and the impact that it has had both on the economies, the humanitarian and political aspects and lives of specific countries that we've conducted case studies on, as well as how the sanctions have affected our ability to effectively combat climate change, hoping to make a case towards actually recommending different alternatives in international relations than sanctions. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Tate, who is going to do a brief introduction of our team and who we are.
Hello, so I'm Tate. I'm the 2nd team lead. This is a team that comes from, as Brian mentioned, we're a team of Harvard undergraduates. We study various different things ranging from more STEM fields like chemistry and environmental science to more humanities like European studies and social sciences like government and economics. So we study a whole range of different topics from different fields, and we're also from all over the world, from at home in Massachusetts to different places like Greece and Spain, Texas, Virginia, really a global team, taking perspectives from all across the world and all different fields to compile together a brief that helps inform us on this type of topic. And I think we can pass it over to our final team lead, Darlene.
Good evening, everyone. Again, I am Darlene. I am also one of the team leads here for the Global Peace team, and I just wanted to talk to you guys about the executive summary for tonight's event. Our amazing team here of 14 researchers have been investigating the intersectionality between US sanctions and the subsequent impact it's had on climate change through case studies, exploring how sanctions are contributing to a worsening climate crisis. So our discussion tonight will venture from synthesized case studies on US sanctions in Russia, China, and Iran, as well as the rationale behind their implementation that have been propagated as well. We'll also be looking into the consequences of US sanctions within the recipients, from the economy to the politics, to humanitarian interests as well, and the global fight against climate change. So we'll also be looking into US cooperation with other nations and other international actors, and the US commitments to the global South and how we've measured up to what we've put out in the long term. So we invite stakeholders such as policymakers and climate change activists, and anyone on this call really who's decided to show up today to consider potential unintended consequences of sanctions to guide more informed decision-making. And this knowledge, we hope, will lead to the formulation of policies that balance foreign policy objectives, but also environmental concerns. So we thank you for the time that you took today to look into this.
So what are we working on? Sanctions are punitive or coercive measures imposed by one or more countries or another country, entity, or individual to achieve specific political, economic, or social goals. As for the types and controversies, sanctions encompass various forms, including trade restrictions, asset freezes, travel bans, and diplomatic isolation, while intended to induce change that can result in unintended consequences. The academic discourse surrounding sanctions is characterized by debates on the efficacy, ethical implications, and unanticipated outcomes in international diplomacy.
Within academic discourse and literature, there are American values and themes cited in rationalizing the uses of sanctions. Firstly, sanctions are an example of neoliberal diplomacy and economic coercion. The United States employs sanctions to promote open economies and free trade globally. Additionally, economic coercion through sanctions are argued to achieve diplomatic objectives without direct military conflict. Secondly, sanctions are argued to foster partnerships among like-minded nations, enhancing collective geopolitical influence. Finally, sanctions are tied to the military-industrial complex. Industry investments benefit generals and military personnel, aligning their interests with maintaining military assets. Subsequently, the stakes of endangering military assets, such as a perceived change in US commitment to exuding influence overseas, have risen. In fact, President Joe Biden has recently increased the national budget defense to $866 billion.
So going off of what Brian said, the United States also uses the idea of being a peacekeeper archetype inside their identity when implementing sanctions. All across the world, the United States might be seen as the police of the world, or even, as the United States calls itself, a city upon a hill, to try to symbolize their global symbol of virtue. This is used to justify sanctions, as the United States says they do so to protect democracy or defend human rights. However, there are ulterior motives the United States uses to implement sanctions under this disguise. One of which is to stop regimes from challenging Western influence. Iran's defiance against Western influence is an example of this. It is important to note Iran has a lucrative oil market the United States has tried to exert control over several times in the past. Sanctions, furthermore, become a tool to disrupt regions that pose challenges to Western geopolitical dominance. We can see this in Iran in a closer look when studying the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. APAC, or also known as APAC, which has drafted an anti-Iran report during a period of Iran-US diplomatic engagement. This report tried to encourage the United States to implement sanctions, and a lot of people say it might, US policymakers might feel a little guilted to do so because of their high contributions. This goes furthermore saying that AIPAC had donated $13.5 million in 2022, which shows how high-ranking it is inside US politicians' minds when creating policy decisions.
And here's the case for supporting sanctions. So they're considered coercive policy tools. So sanctions serve as coercive instruments aimed at influencing policies without resorting to full-scale warfare. They can also have symbolic and instrumental motivations. Sanctions can fulfill both symbolic purposes, like moral signaling, and instrumental goals, such as inducing economic pressure. Sanctions are typically expected to align with democratic values, often emphasizing humanitarian concerns and the resolution of crises. And what's considered success is perceived by voters in the sending country, involve compelling the targeted country to make comprehensive behavioral change. Some factors that influence this public support is typically stronger if it's viewed as like a last resort in policy negotiations, which employs moral signaling and economic backlash. And a case study of this is Sudan. An example regarding the support for sanctions is the UN Security Council's resolution 1556, which imposed sanctions on Sudan in order to disarm militias and condemn their leadership. This highlights the widespread support these measures garnered in the US due to concerns over human rights violations.
And in terms of reasons for opposition to sanctions, legal and humanitarian grounds are a main concern. So many scholars challenge or reject the legality of sanctions under international human rights law. And as an example of why this happens, sanctions can cause mass displacement, hunger, reduced access to medical care, and other negative humanitarian effects. And one UN report estimated that sanctions in sum caused over 40,000 deaths from 2017 to 2018. And some argue that this meets the definition of crimes against humanity or collective punishment. Sanctions may also violate the general international legal principles of sovereignty, self-determination, and non-intervention, and even targeted sanctions such as freezing the bank accounts of individual regime leaders may violate the rights to a fair trial, property, and privacy. And as for economic and strategic reasons for opposition to sanctions, they often carry unintended negative economic consequences for non-targeted states and individuals. And as one example, global aluminum prices increased by over 20% after the US sanctioned a major Russian aluminum production company in 2018. And in addition, there's growing competition to the US dollar in financial system, as exemplified by investment in cross-border payment systems by China, Russia, the EU, and others. And as a result, the smaller economies typically targeted by US sanctions will become increasingly able to conduct trade in non-US currencies and avoid the most severe economic impacts of sanctions. And finally, targeted regime leaders are often the least likely to suffer the intended hardships of economic sanctions because they can circumvent sanctions through third parties and through public resources, patronage, and other special privileges. And this can cause sanctions to actually be counterproductive in that they strengthen regimes which are able to consolidate power under the guise of stabilizing an economy hit by sanctions. And one analysis found that sanctions actually increase repression of citizens and rival groups.
Great, let's discuss sanctions as a political choice. There are many complex and unintended consequences of sanctions. First, harm to innocent citizens. Sanctions often lead to unintended harm for innocent citizens while failing to effectively restrain targeted regimes as states find ways to circumvent the sanctions. Sanctions can also produce unintended and adverse consequences, leading to complexities beyond their intended objectives. Sanctions also have a nuanced impact and affect interstate dynamics. The effectiveness of sanctions varies due to factors like the nature of interstate relationships and the selective application of sanctions. Interstate dynamics, including trade relationships and past alliances, sometimes override accountability, resulting in instances of hypocrisy. There are also many challenges after implementing sanctions. There's a disproportionate impact on vulnerable populations. Sanctions disproportionately affect these vulnerable people and can fuel ethnic discrimination in target countries. They also can fuel domestic instability. Sanctions may inadvertently contribute to domestic terrorism and interstate conflict by creating economic hardships. The cases of Côte d'Ivoire, Mali's mutiny, and the Trump administration's sanctions on Sudan illustrate complexities and varying outcomes of sanctions, including recognition decisions, economic assistance, and human rights considerations.
Another large part of our research was case studies, and so we used China, Iran, and Russia to analyze how sanctions impacted the economy, the politics, and humanitarian rights and instances in all of these countries. One of the first examples was in China. So in looking at sanctions placed on China, one thing to consider is that in the literature, a lot of it is recently published because China is a unique case given its role in the global economy. Usually United States sanctions are placed on countries that are peripheral to the global economy, meaning that there isn't as much effectiveness and it's not any sense of backlash on the US economy itself. So one such example is in 1989, following the Tiananmen Square incident, countries imposed sanctions on China because of the humanitarian rights crisis. And one example is during the Clinton administration, most favored nation trade status, meaning that China would have special instances of like trade relations and things like that. It was tied to humanitarian rights and the amount of money that was given to China, but it was later removed because US economic interests always and often outweigh humanitarian concerns. Also, in regards to the Uyghur Autonomous Region, quote, they were gross violation of human rights against the population, and it was considered a genocide. And even though sanctions continue to be placed, there's still this question of whether or not sanctions are right for handling ethnic minorities. I will now pass it off to my partner, Emil.
Yeah, so speaking a little more on the sanctions effectiveness and the humanitarian impact, we can see that the United States issued specific sanctions against popular Chinese telecommunication companies that engaged in biometric surveillance, and they tracked ethnic minorities like the Uyghur population. And so although this legislation, as well as legislation like the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act and Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act have been passed to negatively impact China's economy, the Uyghur population continues to suffer massive human rights abuses. And so even though like allegations about how the Uyghur Autonomous Region in China faces widespread human rights abuses, and this triggered like global condemnation, restrictions, and sanctions, including from the US, the Uyghur population is still facing genocide. And so the sanctions effectiveness is inconclusive.
We will now examine the political impact of the sanctions. So the political impact of US imposed sanctions on China greatly rely on principles of governance between the two countries. So Chinese theories of governance often emphasize discipline, social and political obedience, while Confucian values often emphasize that citizens have a responsibility to be obedient to the elites. This contributes to a beneficiary cycle where the elites provide care to the citizens. So Western-based sanctions come into direct conflict with these ideas because they promote contestation and conflict with the Chinese styles of governance, which often strengthens the regime's power. Looking specifically at Tiananmen Square, after the Tiananmen Square incident, President Bush suspended arms trades and government charges with China, which subsequently introduced restrictions on US aid to China. After the Tiananmen sanctions, China faced a regime change from Jiang Zemin to Yu Jinato as China's supreme leader, prompting more coercive political control on Chinese citizens. As a result, citizens who already had a personal bias against US foreign policy significantly opposed sanctions imposed by the US, especially those with external pressure.
Yeah, so going off of what Ife says, sanctions have also had a very big impact on China politically in terms of their modes of retaliation, diplomatic severities, and also a rhetorical war. So just for context, after the COVID-19 pandemic, China has engaged in what they called healthcare diplomacy to repair its global image. They did this by donating very high amounts of PPE in the West, and also donating 2.2 billion vaccines throughout the world. Doing so, they tried exerting more geopolitical influence and trying to measure up as the United States. However, the United States has seen this somewhat as a threat to them economically and geopolitically, which has both China and the United States engaging in a rhetorical war. Mike Pompeo, the former Secretary Mike Pompeo, is an example of this after he called China a threat to all democracies across the world. And China has also retaliated against this by calling the United States imperialist and antagonized the country in its state media. This antagonization can create a very high amount of nationalism and unity behind their leaders, motivating workers in the country to boost their economies and sort of compete on each other's ends to see who can come out as the higher global power at the end of the day. China has also retaliated against the United States form of sanctions with adding US officials to specially designated nationals and block persons list, also known as the SDN list, and freezing their assets. Secret operation of US sanctions states. Also, China has had secret operation inside other US sanctioned states, such as Iran, to expose their firms and deter Western independence on their market. For example, Chinese has operated their technology company secretly inside post-sanctions in Iran in order to have a bigger market in places where the US has sanctioned.
Great, let's dig more into the economic impact of these sanctions. The US's sanctions against China have harmed not just China, but the world at large. Sanctions against Huawei fractured the semiconductor chip supply chain and reduced the GDP of both China and the United States. Sanctions on cotton grown in the Xinjiang region did not cause the Chinese government to cease its human rights violations against the Uyghurs, therefore proving ineffective. Let's talk about Huawei. Suspicious of Huawei's involvement in espionage for the Chinese government, in 2018, the Trump administration prohibited US entities from purchasing from the company. What are the impacts of this? Huawei's share in the global smartphone market dropped from 15% to 3% between 2020 and 2021. Huawei's chairperson, Eric Xu, blamed US sanctions for the 2021 global semiconductor chip shortage, citing fractured trust in the supply chain as a key issue. This US-China trade war increases consumer costs by $51 billion annually and could remove 0.9% of China's GDP and 0.7% of the US's GDP. Let's also talk about the Uyghur human rights policy of 2020. China's genocide and abuse of the Uyghurs led to the US banning cotton from the Xinjiang region. However, all that happened was the fashion industry supply chain was fractured since this policy blacklisted 1/5 of the world's cotton supply, but cotton from this region continues to be used and the genocide has not ended. This means that sanctions have a huge economic impact on all of the affected parties. However, they don't actually lead to governments behaving differently.
Sanctions have also had a devastating humanitarian impact in Iran, to segue to another country. First, sanctions fueled inflation in Iran by disrupting supply chains and also by decreasing oil revenue, which forced the government to finance their budget deficits with expansionary monetary policy and also led to the devaluation of the rial, which is why Obama's sanctions in 2012 led to inflation rising above 30%, and Trump's sanctions in 2018 led to prices rising by over 85%. Additionally, sanctions have also had a detrimental impact on accessibility to food, medicine, and medical products. For example, in 2012, sanctions led to shortages of rice, corn, and cooking oil. And in 2018, sanctions led to the prices of milk, yogurt, and eggs, among other critical food products, rising by up to 150%. Additionally, compliance fears associated with sanctions limited imports of medicine and medical equipment, which is why from 2011 to 2012, exports of pharmaceutical products from the US to Iran fell by 50%. And from 2018 to 2019, total Iranian imports of medical supplies decreased by 60%, which affected 6 million Iranians that had serious medical conditions. Additionally, because the government lost billions of dollars in oil revenue due to sanctions, welfare payments for the bottom 20% of society in Iran decreased by 40% from 2017 to 2019.
So, in addition to the humanitarian impacts in Iran that you just heard about, there were also economic impacts of the sanctions in Iran. So, looking at the overall GDP, the sanctions did have the intended impact of hurting the Iranian economy severely. So, both times that the US and the West imposed sanctions on Iran, the first time in 2011 and then again in 2018, Iran suffered a huge economic recession as a result of it. So, in 2011, because of the sanctions jointly imposed by the US, the EU, and the UN, Iran's GDP decreased by 11% total from the time when the sanctions were imposed between 2011 and 2014. Again, after the 2018 sanctions that the US unilaterally imposed, Iran's GDP growth rate contracted by 2.3% in 2018 and then again by 2.7% in 2019. However, looking at this from a decrease in overall GDP is a fairly surface level way to examine the economic impacts of these sanctions on Iran, because those decreases in overall GDP have not actually hindered the growth of Iran's nuclear program, which expanded during both sanction periods, and constricting the nuclear program was the original intended impact of those sanctions in the first place. And part of this, and a large part of this, is due to the unequal economic results of these sanctions. So the 2011 sanctions led to 12% of Iranian households moving directly into transitory poverty. And the large majority of households that were impacted in this way and suffered the bulk of the impacts of GDP decreases were rural households made up of religious minorities, where the head of the household, so the person who typically went and earned money in the household, was someone who received less education and worked in the private sector. So that type of individual and that type of household had the highest likelihood of experiencing poverty as a result of these sanctions, which kind of shows you why these sanctions were unable to have a real impact in terms of the political elite and the people actually in control of policy in Iran. Furthermore, it also led to decreased living standards for people in Iran. Inflation adjusted government spending on things like welfare, healthcare, and education all decreased during the period when sanctions were imposed. Lastly, due to the fact that Iran is trying to develop a resistance economy, the sanctions that are currently imposed on Iran are predicted to get less and less effective over time. So many conservative Iranian politicians with a hardline and anti-West stance have promoted the creation of a resistance economy as a solution to sanctions ever since the West first imposed them in 2011. This resistance economy idea is somewhat succeeding. The Chinese-Iranian trade is currently valued at $16 billion, which makes China Iran's #1 trading partner, and they have been for 10 years consecutively. Iran and China also have a new 25-year trade agreement, and Iran was recently added to China's Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is an organization of all of China's economic and trading allies. So all of this shows you how Iran, as a result of sanctions and in response to those sanctions, is trying out new alternatives and moving away from a Western-based trading system.
And now to explore the political impact of sanctions in Iran, we'll start by looking at domestic politics. So counter to their intentions, sanctions have strengthened the existing government. As previously mentioned, when sanctions wreak economic havoc, officials can consolidate control over the economy to control those effects while employing patronage and other tools to protect themselves from the full negative effects of sanctions. And with these political elites self-insulating themselves, the middle and upper class Iranians, who are most likely to be sympathetic to Western causes, are forced to suffer the brunt of sanctions' negative economic impacts. This fuels anti-US sentiment and resentment among would-be allies. And furthermore, the US's withdrawal from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and also known as JCPOA, and the subsequent maximum pressure campaign of sanctions by the US have further compounded Iranian disillusionment with the US as an unfair and unreliable negotiating partner. And the correlation between Iranian popular movements and international sanctions is ambiguous at best. During protests, for example, against economic conditions from 2017 to 19, and during the Green Movement uprising from 2009 to 2010, sanctions were either suspended or relatively light, which shows that sanctions themselves were not motivating public unrest with the existing regime. And as for nuclear policy, sanctions from 2011 to 2015 did motivate Iran's willingness to negotiate the JCPOA. However, it was the robust negotiations and tangible sanctions relief, not the sanctions themselves, that were the incentive that ultimately slowed down Iran's nuclear development. And despite the US's current maximum pressure sanctions campaign, Iran continues to develop its nuclear weapon capabilities. And although these sanctions were supposed to pressure Iran into accepting a more stringent version of JCPOA, Iran has refused to begin negotiations unless the US offers sanction relief as a precondition.
And on to sanctions in Russia on political impact. Russia is planning to double down on its current stance in the war in Ukraine instead of softening its offensive position in accordance with pressure from the West. For 2023, Russia has planned defense expenditures of 4,981 billion rubles, which is 66.41 billion US dollars, an increase of 302.9 billion rubles from 2022. Sanctions have not yet tangibly changed the political atmosphere of the Kremlin to the point of a Russian retreat or withdrawal. Furthermore, the sanctions spearheaded by the United States may have alienated allies. In a geopolitical forum in New Delhi, India, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov received applause for bringing up the hypocrisy of condemning Russian action in Ukraine and the United States' history in Iraq and other military interventions. Additionally, Russia has tied American and European sanctions to food insecurity and energy insecurity in developing countries, leading to increased distrust of Western powers. The number of countries who favor Russia increased by 29 last year to 35 this year, according to the Economist Intelligence Unit. It is unlikely that the sanctions leveraged by the US on Russian officials will produce enough political dissent to compel the government to end the war against Ukraine. Due to the personalistic nature of Russia's regime, political dissenters lack the ability to pressure Putin or willingly leave the Kremlin system, resulting in complacency. If economic conditions in Russia continue to deteriorate, discontent may increase among the Russian people. However, as recently as last fall, polling showed that Russians believed that they may be better off economically than they had been prior to the start of the war. Satisfaction with living standards was above 50% in every region of the country.
Our analysis of Russia and the impact of sanctions imposed by the US is unique in that we considered two components. One, Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the US's economic response through the use of sanctions, and also of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. What is apparent is that there is long-term damage imposed on the Russian economy that has been made clear from their annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the use of economic sanctions against large Russian state banks, which resulted in foreign capital becoming more expensive and also causing a dramatic decline in their foreign debt, and which correlated to a 16% of decline in their GDP. The Russian economic growth has also slowed significantly to only 0.3% each year compared to the 2.3% global average increase rate. However, despite the damages that are apparent, these sweeping economic sanctions that have been imposed in 2022 and forth harm more than just those who are targeted. The most recent sanctions on Russia have crippled the Russian economy in the short term, and these impacts have been absorbed by innocent civilians. Over 400 Western companies have withdrawn from Russia, both due to fears that the economy will not look good for them, as well as direct orders from both the Trump administration and the Biden administration. And these have impacted the average civilian through less supply and higher prices. And the scarcity of goods are known to result in the rise of black markets. And naturally, those in lower classes will face harsher impacts from rapid inflation. But most economic sanctions on Russia experience only limited short-term successes. Those on select Russian banks with the SWIFT restrictions led to their inability to engage in foreign transactions, which resulted in an almost 30% decline in the value of the ruble. But the central bank of the Russian Federation increased their interest rates by about 20%, allowing the ruble to rebound almost immediately. And it rose 45% against the dollar in 2022, reinforcing their ability to recuperate.
So the next part of our presentation is on the United States, their diplomatic relations, and how all of that relates to oil and climate change. So oil is an important strategic lever for the United States internationally. Oil is a unique and valuable commodity that is frequently utilized by many different countries as leverage in global affairs. And the US, as a global dominant power, therefore employs oil as a foreign policy tool frequently to exert control over oil-producing nations in alignment with its interests. There are a couple of different motivations for the US to want to control oil and the oil trade. First of all, the US actions to control those countries are fueled by economic interests in accessing oil reserves and making sure that oil prices domestically are kept low. The second point of motivation is also geopolitical influence over nations that have significant oil reserves, such as Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Russia. A third motivation is also national security, because the US wants and needs to ensure a stable supply of oil, both for its military and for its domestic needs. So in the next case studies, we will explore first the interactions regarding oil between Saudi Arabia and countries like the US and China, and second, how oil sanctions affect climate change.
Firstly, this timeline highlights some major domestic and international moments in the oil market. In 1960, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries was created by Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela in response to US oil quotas, giving these oil exporting countries more bargaining power. In 1970, the percentage of domestic oil produced peaked, but quickly fell after Nixon ended the quota, allowing for imported oil to rise to 30% and even to 50% in 1977. In 1973, the US support for Israel in the Yom Kippur Wars caused embargoes to be placed, causing an oil crisis. In 1997, the Kyoto Protocol was introduced and signed by almost every major emitter except for the United States, Australia, and China. The United States began to diversify its importation, and in 2004, Canada exceeded Saudi Arabia for oil imports, and offshore drilling went from 8% of all US oil to 30% in 30 years. Finally, after the Russia-Ukraine conflict in 2023, the US stepped in to fill the lack of Russian oil, and in the process opened up more pipelines and drilling, such as the Keystone XL pipeline and the Willow project.
President Biden has a highly mixed legacy on climate change. Many of his accomplishments include removing new leases for oil and gas drilling on public lands and in federal waters, rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement, which is expected to decrease US emissions between 32 and 42% below 2015 levels, and also incorporates many of the provisions of Biden's original Build Back Better Act, which only passed in the House, but aimed to promote sustainable infrastructure and to distribute up to $29 billion to projects seeking to reduce pollution. Additionally, many problems arose in terms of Biden's climate agenda. For example, in the Inflation Reduction Act, there are provisions which commit a large portion of the Gulf of Mexico to oil drilling, and provisions preventing offshore oil drilling were removed from the original Build Back Better Act, which once again only passed in the House. Biden also failed to realize his oil agenda to the fullest extent, given that he replaced his March 2023 budget proposal that would eliminate all oil and gas subsidies with simply a symbolic executive order to move towards environmental justice for all. Additionally, Biden also approved up to 6,430 permits for oil and gas drilling on public lands, including the Willow project, which will have a detrimental impact on the environment.
Next, we'll move to US and Saudi Arabia and explore their complex relationship. So this is a fragile yet complicated relationship. So the current state of the Saudi Arabia-US relationship is unclear, but it appears to be delicate and built on a mix of mutual benefit and challenges. So the relationship is underpinned by both parties' reliance on each other, despite inherent complexities. Moving to the historical agreements and turning points. So the relationship traces back to the founder of Saudi Arabia and early oil agreements like Chevron's 1933 concession to explore Saudi Arabia, as well as a 1973 embargo, which is where the relationship faced a pivotal moment when Saudi Arabia embargoed oil sales to the US in response to its support for the Israeli military, as well as OPEC influence in 2014, where Saudi Arabia's leadership convinced OPEC to maintain high oil production, influencing global oil dynamics. Finally, let's talk a little bit about contemporary collaborations and partnerships. So despite uncertainties, the Biden administration carries forward collaboration, and this is evident through the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment.
Now looking at the international impacts of the US-Saudi Arabia collaboration, we're going to start by looking at the history of our counterterrorism efforts and the impact of them. So the US and Saudi Arabia collaborated during the Soviet-Afghan War, providing support to Afghan jihad forces opposing the Soviet invasion. And while preventing Soviet takeover, this collaboration led to the growth of Afghan jihad forces, which ultimately paved the way for the emergence of the Taliban and their global acts of war. Today, the US-Saudi counterterrorism partnership is complex but ultimately effective, because despite contributing to the shrinkage of the IS in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia still maintains relationships with several terrorist organizations like the Lashkar-e-Taiba in Pakistan. And also in terms of the US-Saudi military role in the Yemen crisis, Saudi Arabia has been a key provider of military support to the Yemeni government to counter Houthi gains in the Yemeni civil war. And the US has facilitated this role by exporting over $8.2 billion in defense materials to Saudi Arabia since 2014. And although their stated goal is to support the legitimate Yemeni government, the military collaboration has also contributed to the perpetuation of the war and the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Yemen, which has caused substantial casualties and millions in need of humanitarian assistance.
So when analyzing climate change, diversifying Saudi Arabia's energy resources is crucial due to economic vulnerability tied to oil, which is the backbone of its economy, and the necessity to mitigate fossil fuels' environmental impacts. Ranking sixth globally in oil consumption, the kingdom lags in both energy variety and population-adjusted use of oil, and in only a decade, daily oil consumption doubled from 1.5 million to 2.8 million barrels, highlighting the urgency for solar and nuclear alternatives. Reliance on fossil fuels ultimately poses risks, pushing Saudi Arabia to prioritize long-term diversification. Currently, oil reserves fuel revenue, but volatile prices and sanctions challenge this, as with budget cuts since 2016, including fuel subsidies, there's an aim for economic efficiency, which in turn harms the environment. Heavy oil reliance makes the nation vulnerable to economic shocks, emphasizing the need for stability through alternative energy investment. Addressing climate change, Saudi Arabia ranked 9th in CO2 emissions with 600 million tons in 2020, a net zero goal, which is something achieved when all emissions released by human activities and industries are counterbalanced by removing carbon from the atmosphere, by 2060 involves completely restructuring the economy for energy, industry, and operations. However, there are doubts due to fluctuating oil prices and past diversification failures in the kingdom. Additionally, the Paris Agreement commitment targets halving emissions to 278 million tons via renewable energies, hydrogen, and emissions capture. However, again, the kingdom's past reliance on hydrocarbon exports contradicts this. And despite expert opinions, Saudi Arabia's entrenched oil reliance and past diversification failures cast doubt on effective change to whether or not their goals will be met in the future.
So in the United States and China relations, the oil market serves as a very big focal point of economic tension between the two countries. From January 2023, the United States House of Representatives took action and voted to restrict oil exports from its emergency stockpile to China. This decision was triggered by significant exports of oil to a subsidiary of China's state-run oil company, Sinopec, in the prior year. The move reflects growing concerns over the dynamics of oil trade and China's influence on it. And also China increasing its presence in the South China Sea, an area that's very highly contested and full of tension inside the region, and creating a stronger alliance with Saudi Arabia has alerted the United States of its increasing geopolitical and economic influence.
So there are four major international impacts of China-Saudi's changing relationship. Firstly, power dynamics and economic concerns. While China's rising economic influence and higher petroleum cooperation raises worries about the US losing its primary economic partner status, the US still remains a regional hegemon due to Saudi Arabia's currency being pegged to the dollar and its reliance on US military aid. Secondly, the economic impact of collaboration. The substantial surge in Saudi Arabia-China bilateral trade is evident in the $33.4 billion worth of Saudi exports to China and the $31.8 billion worth of Chinese exports to Saudi Arabia in 2020, showcasing the tangible impact of their collaborative efforts. Third, the mediator role and diplomatic influence. China plays a distinctive role as a mediator, particularly between Iran and Saudi Arabia, where differing perceptions of the United States as an antagonist due to sanctions for Iran and as a weak actor on Iranian policy for Saudi Arabia underscore China's diplomatic future. Fourth, shared diplomatic goals and global aspirations. With the aim to expand diplomatic partnerships beyond the traditional Western allies, Saudi Arabia and China are forging a growth strategy that encompasses improved infrastructure, heightened industry profits, and increased political clout, collectively driving their aspirations for greater global power.
The United States and China have been the world's two largest emitters since the start of the century, yet they previously refused to cooperate. By 2008, the US and China were already jointly responsible for 40% of global emissions. The two countries were engaged in a climate change suicide pact at the time, each blaming the other for the bulk of global emissions while trying to claim the moral high ground. However, they did make unilateral internal commitments to reducing emissions. China set a goal to reduce its economic energy intensity by 20% by 2010, and most US states had energy emission reduction targets of between 50 to 80% by 2050. The two countries began to collaborate under President Barack Obama and Chairman Xi Jinping in a series of joint presidential statements released from 2013 to 2015. The two countries pledged to cut greenhouse gas emissions significantly before 2030. In late 2015, the US joined with China and 194 other international parties to create and sign the Paris Climate Accords, the most comprehensive international treaty on climate change at the time. The collaborative relationship between US and China has recently been tested. The Trump administration rolled back on many previous climate agreements and policies, including the Paris Climate Accords. The issue of climate cooperation was also never put on the agenda of US-China summits during the Trump administration. One major possibility for renewed US-China climate cooperation lies in the rise of emission trading systems, or ETSs. ETSs are largely considered a cost-effective tool that aligns profit-making market interests with goals of decarbonization. China has already built ETSs in 8 different provinces and cities: Beijing, Chongqing, Fujian, Guangdong, Hubei, Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Zhejiang. Many US states have also built ETSs through the Regional Greenhouse Gas Emissions Reduction Act. The US and China can regain lost ground in climate cooperation by linking their ETSs.
So despite large drops in revenue due to price caps and embargoes, Russian oil exports has actually increased and approached all-time highs as stated in the BBC. Exports to India and China accounted for much of this increase, with India importing 10 times more than what it did. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the overwhelming effect of international sanctions and warfare has caused the country to stray from its clean energy goals. Environmental policies and organizations like the Russian Socio-Ecological Union have been weakened by the Russian government to cope with this gaping hole in Western oil export revenue. The time it will take for Russia to become dependent on renewable energy has been prolonged by at least 35 years, according to the Russian Institute of Economic Forecasting. The government has cited EU-led sanctions as a reason for its halted decarbonization and accelerated consumption of carbon emissions. Furthermore, the European bloc imported less than a quarter of its gas from Russia in late 2022, down from over half in 2019, with petrol following a similar lead. But this is no cause of celebration for the environment, since imports from the United States and Kingdom of Saudi Arabia increased noticeably over the same period. The pressure to decrease reliance on gas from Russia led to a 7% increase in European demand for coal, concerning many environmentalists. According to the Nature Climate Change Journal, the EU's embargo on Russia will raise its consumptions of carbon emissions and create an economic toll throughout the continent, only leaving room for optimism through the potential shifts towards renewable energy due to increased prices of oil, which will not be attained if US and Saudi imports keep increasing at the same rate.
Prior to its invasion of Ukraine, Russia supplied the EU with approximately 40% of its gas. Afterwards, however, gas shares dropped to as low as 10% in 2023. This created an energy gap that US LNG or liquefied natural gas companies were eager to fill. And US LNG contracting went up dramatically, with 14 deals signed in 2021 to 45 long-term deals signed in 2022. However, it is of note that most of these new US LNG contracts are with Asian rather than European companies. And rather than stabilizing energy supplies, these contracts only serve to worsen global dependence on fossil fuels and increase exploitation. Another idea is the political motivation of several lawmakers. Republican lawmakers have urged President Biden to stop his regulations on fossil fuels and restore America's energy dominance, calling on legitimate concerns that Russia wields significant influence over Europe due to their historical reliance on coal and gas and oil that have only increased with disasters such as the Fukushima disaster. And the American Petroleum Institute has called on this, urging the US to increase domestic fracking to combat Russia's power and influence in that field. And this has drawn lots of criticism from environmental activists. Greenpeace, a prominent environmental nonprofit, suggests that increased production is unnecessary due to import capacity and LNG numbers. Policy should reflect ideas that support people globally rather than promoting merely American capitalist goals and merely just oil and gas companies. And there have been suggestions of introducing a green Marshall Plan to, pose another real solution to the legitimate concerns of Russia's influence.
Finally, let's discuss global North and global South relations. Numbers are clear. The global North contributes to a jarring amount of the world's emissions. The global North is responsible for 50% of the world's emissions. According to Generation Climate Europe, the top 10% of global emitters by individuals contributed to 48% of global CO2 emissions. The United States has emitted the most carbon to date and is responsible for at least 25% of carbon dioxide emissions. The bottom 50% of global emitters, mostly southern countries, were responsible for about 12% of global emissions. Those in the top 10% amounted to around 771 million individuals, and those in the bottom 50% amounted to around 3.8 billion individuals. As for the current agreements, at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change last year, in November 2022, 195 countries agreed to create a fund for the loss and damages that arose from the effects of climate change. This is an extension of current US foreign policy, as the funds are limited and the government lacks proper clearance to affect change. Now moving to the Global South contributions. Most developing countries in the Global South point to their need for climate financing to properly meet the burden of their obligations. For example, the African Development Bank estimated that their countries collectively would need $30 billion per year to actualize their climate goals under the Paris Agreement until 2030.
Okay, so that was the end of our presentation. Overall, the conclusions that we wanted to draw is that sanctions seem to have limited efficiency when it comes to actually implementing the goals that the US sets for its allies and potential cooperators in the global scene. So given that we covered a lot of topics today, we just wanted to make sure that we have enough time for anyone to ask questions, clarifications, any concerns, and our researchers are available to answer, depending on the area of their expertise and what they've researched on. But anyone that has a question, feel free to just raise your hand and we'll do our best to answer. Yes, Mateo.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I'm curious if any of you could speak a little bit about why you chose the countries you did for your case study, especially thinking about climate change considerations. I mean, Venezuela and Cuba are also great considerations. So yeah, just wanting to learn more a little bit about why you chose your countries. Thank you.
Actually, that was one of the greatest concerns that we had when it came to actually starting our research. We wondered which countries we should choose because all of them do share a portion of the global spotlight depending on the developments that are going on at the time. And we actually were considering Latin American countries because of their prominence when it comes to global warming and climate change in particular. But if we're being very honest, the thing that made us choose not to go for them was the limited bibliography that we identified. We just weren't able to have enough academic sources that we felt confident to create a argument that we wanted to present to everyone. And so we opted for China, Iran, and Russia because there was just a plethora of sources to choose from, unfortunately. But it is definitely an area that we want to extend our research to. And within the actual brief that we'll submit to MEP section, we do note that those are very important countries that we should research in the future. Thank you. And then Mr. Root. If you could unmute yourself, because we...
Yes, I sent my question to the mass to MAPA ahead of time. I will keep it very brief, and I know that time is of the essence. My specific question is whether, in your opinion, the U.S. National Security Advisor, who has been working with the semiconductor companies in the U.S., would construe the following two limits in the balance with effectiveness of U.S. sanctions, coupled with the beginning of serious U.S.-China climate change negotiations. Now, I did learn something from this evening, that it wouldn't just be the beginning. Something's been happening, but it's nowhere near enough. And US and China are the two leading emitters of fossil fuels, carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Now, the two points are a green line of exports and investments immediately approved to China and immediately denied to Russia to show US displeasure concerning the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And two, for exports or investments not included in the green line, changing prohibitions and presumptions of denial in US controls to China to case-by-case review. Doesn't take long to describe these two, but it's very involved as to the details to accomplish it.
So I actually happen to have a couple more details specifically when it comes to the first aspect of it, which is the immediate approval of exports to China and denial to Russia in order to showcase our the disapproval of the U.S. when it comes to the current social political climate that is established due to the Ukrainian war. The current procedures when it comes to things that the Biden administration has actually approved say that all Russian imports and exports to Russia are to be automatically declined unless there is an immediate threat to the overall well-being and survival of the American people. Now, within our opinion, we do think that Russia has done has backtracked a lot when it comes to both hitting the environmental and the political goals that the US has set for their cooperation. So we do not know exactly how much more severe the sanctions could get, but from our data, we have seen that oil sanctions could afford to become even more strict, because Russia has managed to find the sideway of India and China when it comes to its exports, so it's getting a lot of its revenue from there, and they do not seem to be willing to stop any of its expenditures in Ukraine. So when it comes to a suggestion that we would make for Russia specifically, it would be to be even harsher when it comes to oil sanctions and collaborate with the European Union and even the extended NATO alliance that exists in countries of the Middle East and specific countries of East Asia through the Istanbul Agreement, for example, that includes the UAE and Saudi Arabia, in order to make sure that Russia is not able to get away from the embargoes that exist. Now, when it comes to the second portion of the question, I do not have any data on it, and I could not answer it. So I cannot formulate an opinion. I don't know if any of our researchers do. If not, we apologize, and we will take note of it in order to see whether it is something that we could include in a brief. Okay, I don't think, but that is the limit of my expertise. I apologize for that. And we are going to have, but thank you a lot for your question. And we're going to move to Mr. Steve Walters.
Hi, I'm Steve Watras in Milwaukee. Thanks for the wonderful presentation, very well researched. Some of the data is a bit out of date, but I wonder if you made any distinction between United Nations sanctions, which have some degree of international legitimacy, and US sanctions that do not, in terms of both intention and outcomes.
Within the actual brief, yes, we do make a point of actual distinguishing between the United States sanctions and the UN ones, because they have a very big difference in the actual impact that they cause and their efficiency. When it comes to the presentation, we just chose to not go into the specific details, except in very particular cases where we deemed that it was useful for the audience to actually know which resolution we're talking about. So it was just for the sake of being brief, but we do know that that comes at the cost of us being precise and actually communicating the fact that the US is not the end all be all of the international relations scene. So, yeah.
Thanks.
But the brief will be uploaded by the MAP section eventually. So if you want to look into actual details and see the actual extent of our research, which is way bigger than what we were able to condense into this very small presentation, feel free to, and we hope that it kind of clarifies our research a little bit better. Thank you. And then we have Ms. Susan.
I want to thank you all so much for what you have put together, your research. It's overwhelming in a wonderful sense, very impressive, and it would be great to have this. So, can we get what you have written, your presentation? And so that was one question. And then the other is, where will you go with this? And how, is there any way for this and for all of your good work to go out to fellow students, or to make for any kind of further action or involvement?
So when it comes to our material being available, first off, I want to thank you for all your kind words. We really appreciate it. The whole team truly put their best steps forward. We have put a lot of work into this, and a lot of hours have been dedicated. Most of our team members are actually rising freshmen within Harvard. So this was one of their first actual contacts with university level research. And if I'm allowed to say, I think they killed it. I think they did an amazing job. We're really proud of them. When it comes to the distribution of materials, our actual brief will be finalized and approved by all stages of leadership within the policy program sometime in September, at which point we will give it and submit it officially to our lovely commissioners in the MAP section, and they will be able to make it available to the entirety of their platform. When it comes to the actual slides for some early material, I will be able to make them available to Brian and Cole after this, and maybe they will be able to post them somewhere within an article or something, so that the viewer will have a reference point to go on until we reach that point. We will present all of our findings within the IOP Palooza, as we call it, in front of our fellow Harvard students. So it would reach a greater community within the Harvard campus. If in the future we make some sort of college in exchange, informational and data exchange program, we will also be able to share with the colleges of the greater Boston area. But for now, Harvard campus and anything that MEP section will be able to amplify our voices for, we will also construct some type of informational materials and pamphlets that will be submitted along with the brief, and the MEP section will be able to distribute them within their organization, and we will do the same in our campus.
Thank you.
Thank you for your kind words. And then Mr. Michael.
Oh, okay, it took me a minute to unmute. Sorry about that. So my question is, since the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 and the whole growth of American hegemony, the U.S. has kind of put itself in the role, or other countries have deferred to the U.S. as the world's policeman. And apparently we do that to make the world safe for foreign investment. Apparently there's a thought that if we didn't have policing forces around the world, that some countries would not pay their bank loans back, and everyone wants to borrow to do infrastructure projects in somebody. So if sanctions were not used and some of the other tools were not used, how do you envision a world that would be safe for foreign investment without some kind of some clawback mechanism like sanctions? I realize sanctions aren't that good, but what would be the alternative? If you could envision a world that allowed the investors to invest in these countries and get a return on their investment safely, what would that world look like?
Thank you for your honestly great question. So it was an obstacle that we encountered a lot of times during our research, the fact that the US has made itself the epicenter of every single discussion within the international relations field, to the point where we even found that the US has been able to exclude itself from all conversations within the International Criminal Court. So one of the main concerns that we have is we are doing all those case studies for Iran, for China, for Russia even, and we're talking about how they're not able to hit the milestone that we've set for them in the humanitarian, political, and economical sphere. But what about if we actually reach a point where the US is not able to do that? No one is going to be able to keep them up to that standard, because they simply have withdrawn themselves from the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and at the same time, they have veto power within the UN. And even though I personally have not been able to fully envision a world in which we can completely rid ourselves of sanctions, I think that a first step would be to actually make a global community and a global guiding body that does not have a hierarchy within its members. Right now, when it comes to posing sanctions, for example, a lot of the times what happens is that we have these contrasting alliances, for example, between China and Russia, that even if the US wants to propose a specific diplomatic measure, humanitarian intervention maybe, even though that is a taboo term within the industry of international relations to use, humanitarian intervention we say in the most lenient sense, that China will be able to veto it, or Russia would, but Russia is not part of the equation. But anyway, one of the countries will be able to veto it. So for me, the first step would be to actually not have those privileged countries, despite the fact that they have done the great work of putting down the foundations of international community. I think we have progressed past the time in which we need someone to look over it. And if we just let the democratic system do its work, we will be able to have some type of regulations. And of course, establishing two courts with actual power, first International Criminal Court, without distinguishing between countries, and the US is no exception. And at the same time, perhaps there are some efforts right now to create an anti-corruption court. They are led by Judge Wolf within the Boston community, actually. And one of their main goals is to actually create a body that will overview the sanctions and the economical milestones and climate milestones that each country has pledged to keep in front of the international community. Of course, these are really big ideas and concepts, and we would need to go into way more detail in order to exactly explain how to substantiate them. But those are the two vague ideas that I have within my head from the research that we have done, and also my general knowledge of the international relations field. We are kind of short on time when it comes to the actual duration of the Zoom meeting, but we will be happy to take one or two final questions. Of course, from Mr. Harrison, our commissioner.
Yeah, thank you to the team for this great research. It's very thought-provoking, and there's so much here. It's a lot to digest. One aspect of U.S. sanctions that I don't think you mentioned is the extraterritorial sanctions, in which the U.S. sanctions third parties that trade with a sanctioned country. And as I understand, this is not accepted in international law, but it has not been effectively challenged by any mechanism. So what is your understanding of that, of the role of that practice?
I'm sorry, for some reason you cut off. If you could just repeat the question.
The role of extraterritorial sanctions used by the U.S. to sanction a third party that trades with the sanctioned country.
We weren't able to actually go into third parties within the actual presentation. That is true. Overall, the opinion that we seem to have formed as a team is that there is a limit to the extent of the net that the US can cast when it comes to actually sanctioning everyone, because it creates a kind of a domino effect in which the sanctions never stop. We had a case study, for example, in China, in which they found a way to sidestep an embargo by collaborating with India for one of their national resources. I believe it was a type of gas. And then the US created this created another like secondary layer of sanctions that was less severe for India. I think this happened around 2018. And then they found out that the China imported gas was actually also transported into Pakistan and other countries. And so this created kind of a domino effect that no one could control. So we do understand that in order for sanctions to be properly efficient, if the US is to go through with them, they need to actually have this wide net. But at the same time, we believe it will be more efficient if sanctions were to prevail for someone else outside of the US international body to be able to just devote their work to that, because otherwise there will always be side doors that the really cunning and experienced politicians in each side will be able to detect and kind of counterbalance the effects of sanctions, like we see Russia doing with oil exports currently.
Thank you. I would like to bring to your attention that August 9 last week, the executive order was not to protect foreign investment, but to stop US investment on semiconductors into China. It's going in the opposite direction.
Thank you for that. I know we've run over time. I just want to extend my thanks to the entire team for all of the time that you put into this, not just tonight, but over the summer. We hope it was an enjoyable task. I think you have done us a real service here. And you've created something not only with your presentation and the slides tonight, but with your forthcoming report that can be used both as an educational tool, but also as an advocacy tool that our activists and volunteers can use to educate not only our members and supporters, but also the lawmakers who will be considering whether to vote for sanctions. And they will now be forearmed with this information, and many of them who claim or purport or truly are supporters of our environment and a livable world for future generations will have this information to consider when they make those decisions on sanctions. So this is not only a great presentation, a great project, but the creation of a tool that will get real use in the short term. So I just want to thank your entire research team, Alexandra, for all the work that was put into this. And we're going to make great use of it.
Thank you. And thank you for giving us the opportunity to collaborate with you. It was a thoroughly enjoyable experience, and we look forward to you guys seeing the actual final product.
Wonderful. So with that, thanks again. And thank you to the audience for tuning in. Be sure we will send out that full report when we get it, as well as a recording to this program, and hopefully your wonderful slides as well, which we will be making available on our website, but also in a follow-up email to all of you. So with that, thanks for joining us, everyone, and I hope you have a fantastic night.